Okay, Ben Casey with Casey Aviation here, and we're going to talk about the Continental engine. And actually, this discussion applies to any piston engine in the PA-46 or other airplanes as well. But we're going to talk specifically about the Continental engine in an early Malibu, 84 through 88. And we're going to talk about some things that can go wrong. And this turbocharging diagram is going to be a good diagram to use for this discussion. This is straight from the POH. I just added some color to it, and that's all. And let's go ahead and get the discussion started. So when things are operating normally, air comes from the airbox here. It's blue and it's cold, and that comes from on the intake that is right under the prop on the outside of the airplane. You can see really easily. Or if you're in alternate air, then it comes from a different way. That's from an intake that's a few feet behind that, and in such a way where the air has to make a turn coming into the engine, and the idea is that ice particles or anything else can't make that turn, and thus you have protection from ice getting into your engine and going to your turbochargers. We'll have a discussion on that here in a second, but normally air is coming cold air is coming from the airbox into your turbochargers. Turbochargers were spun up by the exhaust gas coming and spinning up the hot side. And these turbochargers spin at 100,000 RPMs, which is just wild to think about. That's 1,600 revolutions per second. Just unfathomably fast. Anyway, and the cool air gets spun up and compressed by the turbocharger and gets kind of hot, as shown by the orange. Not nearly as hot as the exhaust gases, but pretty hot. And then it goes to a heat exchanger, which kind of looks like a radiator of your car. It just blows cool ambient air over, but not mixing, just blows ambient air across the turbocharged air and cools it off just a little bit. And so now it's yellow. And then that air is put into your engine. This little butterfly valve right here is your throttle. That's all you're moving when you're moving the throttle back and forth. High power setting moves this more to a vertical position where lots of air can come in. And in this picture right here, if you can see, the throttle's nearly closed, it looks like. Anyway, and then it goes into your manifold and fuel and air mix, where the fuel gets injected into the cylinder. Suck, squeeze, bang, and blow. And on the blow, the exhaust gas is dumped outside, or not outside into the atmosphere, but it leaves the cylinder and then is used to spin up the hot side of the turbocharger, like I already said. And these gases are really, really hot. They spin up the turbocharger, and then they get to leave and get dumped out into the atmosphere. And that is a real basic description of how your turbocharged Continental engine works. Let's talk about some things that can go wrong. Let's say you are thinking you're going to fly through some icing, and so you go from primary air to alternate air, and you make that switch, and sure enough, you go through some ice, and the filter on the primary air intake is all iced up. It's clogged up with particles. And you get to the other side of the ice, and you make the mistake of going back to primary. Now that's a mistake. Whenever you go from primary to alternate air, you stay in alternate until you are on the ground. Because if you go back to primary, then your engine will then suck up some of the ice particles that are stuck in your air filter, and will go right to your turbocharger, which, like we said, is spinning at 100,000 RPMs, and it's going to incinerate it's just going to obliterate any particles that come in there, and it's just not going to be good. You're probably going to get a turbocharger failure. Now, when that happens, turbochargers typically fail with dramatic fashion, but it's probably going to seize up. And in addition to maybe some other issues, the main thing that's going to happen is you're going to get an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure, because the air that is normally getting spun up here and then going to your engine is now just going to go into your engine without getting spun up, because the turbocharger is no longer spinning. And now you have, if you're up at altitude, you now have really thin air that goes into your engine, and you're probably going to be running now excessively rich. But But the main thing is you're going to get a drop in manifold pressure, because if you flew a normally aspirated engine all the way up to, the flight levels, it's barely going to be able to create, maybe 15, 18 inches of manifold pressure, where here you can create as high as you want. You're cruising around at 30 inches of manifold pressure. So that's going to drop immediately. And you notice that there is no redundancy built into this system. So if you lose this turbocharger for whatever reason, this one is also useless, because all the air is going to find the easiest way to get into the engine, and basically your whole system is going to fail. And they do that on purpose, because if you have if there were a split right here, then you had your 1, 3, and 5 cylinders that were not being able to develop power, and your 2, 4, and 6 developing all kinds of power, there would be it would be lopsided, and your engine would try to throw itself off the mount, and it would not be a good thing for anybody. So there's no redundancy here. So if you lost a turbocharger due to getting some ice in there, you would get an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure. You'd be normally aspirated, and you'd want to descend and go land and figure out what the problem was. So that's one problem. Another thing that can happen is, so there's a fitting that's right here. It's not shown, but there's a fitting that attaches this piping to the heat exchanger, and if that fitting were to fail or pop off, then the same result would happen. Even though the turbochargers are spinning, now your air is getting sucked up through this portion and go into the engine, and you're going to become normally aspirated. Your turbochargers are not effective anymore, and you are going to get, once again, a drop in manifold pressure that was uncommanded, by the way. And that's really not a huge issue. You can fly around all day long at, up to probably 12,000 feet, just like that. And I wouldn't advise you do it, but it's not just a huge emergency per se. You're going to land and go to the shop and say, hey, I had an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure. They're going to go look at it and probably find this fitting came loose or popped off, and they're going to get you a new part, and life is going to be good. It's an easy fix. But the cockpit indication is a drop in manifold pressure. Let's see. Another one is let's say your turbocharger failed for another reason. Your turbochargers are cooled and lubricated with engine oil. And so there's some linkage that goes from the oil in the engine to the turbocharger and back to cool it and lubricate it. And if that linkage somewhere were to break or leak or fail in some way, then your turbocharger is not being cooled or lubricated, and like we already said, at 100,000 RPMs, it is not going to be long before that thing seizes up completely. And when that happens, what do you think the result's going to be? Well, you're normally aspirated now, and you are going to have an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure, and you get to buy a new turbocharger or two for your troubles. And you're going to go land, and it's going to most likely be an expensive endeavor, but not one that's necessarily life-threatening, though sometimes turbochargers can fail quite dramatically. And if they do fail dramatically, what it is the turbocharger is spinning so fast and it stops so suddenly, and there's so much heat and energy created by that sudden stoppage that it can essentially explode and send shrapnel through the engine compartment, hitting whatever it may hit. And if that happens, it will be almost as if a bomb went off in your engine compartment. And depending on what kind of damage happened from the shrapnel flying everywhere, you could have an imminent engine failure, and that's obviously a very real deal. And if your turbocharger does fail, whether it's dramatic or not, it's going to start with a drop in manifold pressure. The most scary thing, or the most dastardly event that can probably happen with a piston engine, is an exhaust leak. So the exhaust comes out of your cylinder and spins up your turbocharger. And if you develop a leak somewhere because your exhaust piping is too thin, or if you're running your exhaust too hot, or if there's also a fitting on this crossover tube, that's what they call this right here. This crossover tube exists to eliminate redundancy, like we already talked about. But if your fitting here fails, if you have an exhaust leak for any reason really, then you now have extremely hot gases being thrown into your engine compartment like it's coming from a blowtorch. I mean, those gases, if you look on your reading, are usually around 1600 degrees. So you now have 1600 degree gas being pointed directly at something and being shot out with pretty good speed. So it's like a blowtorch, and something's going to catch on fire before too terribly long. I don't know if it's going to be some electrical equipment or I guess really anything. It's going to set something on fire, and an engine fire and in flight is a dastardly situation that you will want to land immediately if that happens. You will want to land in the nearest field, not the nearest airport, not the nearest highway, not the nearest pretty field, but probably whatever is under you is what you want to land on, because you want to get out of the air as soon as possible and out of the airplane. And if that happens, the first thing that you're going to see in your cockpit, you've probably noticed a trend by now, is an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure. As soon as there's a leak coming from somewhere, that exhaust gas is going to go out from that place first and not spin up your turbocharger, because it's looking for the path of least resistance. And at that point, your turbochargers aren't spinning and you're normally aspirated. And even though something much more dastardly is to come, the first indication is a drop in manifold pressure that's uncommanded. So these are some of the more common failures, I guess, that you could say within a piston engine, or at least a Continental Malibu. And some of them are user-induced, like if you go from primary to alternate air and then you fly through icing and then you put it back into primary, you are going to have a failed turbocharger, and that is your fault. But also sometimes, these fittings just pop off, or sometimes you just have an exhaust leak and you couldn't have planned for it. But these are, and really there's a million ways that a piston engine can fail. There are so many parts that are moving so fast in opposite directions. I mean, the engine is almost, it's almost just trying to tear itself apart, and it's thanks to some really ingenious design and manufacturing that it manages to not do that. It's really pretty incredible. But these are some of the most common engine failures that you can have, or failures of any kind that you can have. I think Joe has experienced at least one of these, maybe more. You'll have to ask him that when you come to training. But the lesson here is that if you see an uncommanded drop in manifold pressure, you have to treat it like a real deal emergency. It might be a huge deal, and you might see flames coming out, within just a couple minutes, and that's a land as soon as possible emergency. Or it might be not a huge deal. Your little fitting popped off and you have an air intake leak, and you're not going to see any terrible repercussions from that. But you just don't know which one of those it is when you get that uncommanded drop in manifold pressure. So if you're flying around at altitude and your manifold pressure drops without you telling it to, you should declare an emergency and land as soon as possible. You're going to plan to land at the nearest airport, but you're going to monitor things really closely. And if you start to see flames or smoke or any indication of an imminent engine failure, obviously your plan has to change and you're picking a good field. But a drop in manifold pressure that's uncommanded is an emergency. Even if it's really not, you just can't know whether it is or not until you're on the ground. So you are going to treat it like an emergency if you know it's good for you. Another thing to note is that when you get that uncommanded drop in manifold pressure, you're also going to begin to lose pressurization. Your airplane is pressurized from bleed air off the turbochargers. And so when you become normally aspirated due to any of these reasons, you're also going to lose pressurization. It could be a bit of a dramatic event in the cockpit, and that's even more of a reason to descend and go down to land. And we'll probably, when you come to training, we'll probably practice a rapid depressurization event, and you'll get good at that, hopefully. And you'll be more prepared for when you leave and something bad happens. You're more prepared to handle it well and go land the airplane and figure out what the problem was. Ben Casey with Casey Aviation, signing off.